Okay, so welcome to ELA B10 Online. I'm going to go through the learning targets that are in your booklet just to give you a deeper understanding of Shakespeare so that you have hopefully a little bit less questions and you can kind of understand what's going on. Okay, so these are just the background to Shakespeare. So the background of Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote 37 plays and over 150 sonnets or love poetry. If you think back to Romeo and Juliet, the opening to Romeo and Juliet that says, two households, both alike in dignity, and fair run wherever they are seen. That's actually a sonnet. It's 14 lines long. It has the rhyme scheme that he created, the iambic pentameter, with a rhyming couplet. The last two lines rhyme. So the amazing thing about Shakespeare and why we study him is that his plays and his sonnets survived. Before the printing press was ever invented, he actually was able to have them survive through history. So he wrote them out by hand. He actually, when he created the plays, he would write out different parts. So he would give, let's say, let's use Romeo and Juliet. He would give Romeo's part to one person. He would give Juliet's part to another person. He wouldn't give them both, and he wouldn't write the whole play like you would see in a textbook. And if one of those players didn't think that they were getting paid enough money, they could go to a nearby neighboring playhouse and try to get more money from them and try to give the play of what they knew about it to the other person. So there are a bunch of different versions of the play, and those have been compiled together. There's one scene in Macbeth that actually doesn't appear in all versions of Macbeth, but it did exist. So they have it in the one that we're going to look at, and not everywhere, but I will explain it when it comes up. Okay, so Shakespeare also was supported by the kings and queens of his time. So Queen Elizabeth I and King James the First. So they would have paid money for him to actually do stuff. The stage that he actually acted on went into the audience. It's called a thrust stage. That meant that the audience is surrounding three sides of the stage. So if you had to think about what the stage would look like and what the acting would look like, it'd be very different. With the audience surrounding three sides of it, you're not just standing in one spot, you're actually moving around the stage and the theater house in a different way. Think of the theater play performance spaces like the movie theater of our time. How do you know what shows are playing on the movie theater here in Lloydminster? So if you didn't have a cell phone, you couldn't look it up on the internet, you'd have to go to the actual place and then you would take a look at the posters or the actual shows being displayed on the side of it, of the building, before you'd actually go in. And what time of the days would shows play? So movies, they go kind of any time of the day, usually afternoon, evenings. Now, if you compare that to the theater house, how do you know what shows are playing? If you look at these old drawings of the actual theater house, you see a flag at the top. So you would actually see a different colored flag depending on what type of play was actually showing. So for example, if people were dying, a tragedy, it might be a black flag. If it was a white flag, it could be a historical play written about another king or queen of that time, trying to put them in a good light. What time of the day would shows play? In the 1500s and 1600s, there was no electricity. So they would show actual shows during the day. So often when you have things like in Romeo and Juliet where they're like, night, night, oh, dark night, they're literally trying to tell you, imagine it's night, because it's being played in the middle of the day. They would bring out things like candles. They could bring out things like torches. They would use all those kinds of things to actually show you that it's actually night and that they need light to see. Now it says, think about the prices for tickets for concerts. What section pays the most? If you're going to a concert in a theater, you would pay the most for the upfront seats, right? The ones that could be either standing room, like a mosh pit, or like seating right up front where you can actually be really, really close to whomever you're seeing. What seats were the cheapest? They would be the nosebleed or the very high up actual seats. Now it's different. It's the actual opposite for Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. So the seats that had seats were the three tiers of rings around. You would actually pay the most to sit up at the very top. And then it would get less expensive as you went down. And then at the very bottom, when you stood around the stage, you were called a groundling and you paid the cheapest seats. And it was because you actually didn't have seats. You stood there for usually a duration of 3 hours for a play. So parts of the theater and the audience. So the roof over the actors represented. If you can see, it protected them from, of course, all the rain that happens in London, England, but it actually has pictures of the sun and the moon and the stars. So it was the thing that represented the heavens. The trap door in the stage floor represented, you can kind of see it pictured here. It could represent hell. It could represent if there's a tomb or there's some kind of death, that's what it could represent as well. So, of course, I already said the audience that stood around the stage were called groundlings. Literally, they stood on the ground. They paid approximately 1 penny. They stood there during the duration of the show, hours at a time, and usually ate food. The next seats were the lower tier, the gallery that was covered. They would be approximately 2 pennies. Then the price went up from there. But the audience would sit on cushions or be viewed by other audience members. If a member of the royal family or somebody who was rich went, they would often sit at the very top of those tiers so they could be seen and see everybody. Location and closure. Shakespeare's Globe Theatre is located off the Thames River in London. And why is this a good location? So what happens if there's disease or plague? So if you think about the 1500s and 1600s, the river flows right through London, and the Shakespeare's Globe is right off the river. So boats would have been a huge mode of transportation at this time, and that meant that they were right in the center of basically anybody coming in to town. So they could actually take advantage of that entertainment. They could go there, they could watch a show. So why was this a good location? So the following is a little clip from Harry Potter, and it's going to show you London. It still performs plays today, but that gives you an idea of where it is. What happens if there's a plague or a disease? Often the theater houses would close. Similar to COVID, I never thought I would say this, our movie theater had to close because it was large numbers of people gathered in one location, so it couldn't actually exist. So what you need to know about the 1600s, especially the 1500s too, is that the only actors were men and boys. So who played men in plays? Of course, men. Who played the women? This would have been young boys that hadn't gone through puberty or their voice hadn't changed. And of course, when did this change? The first time we see women acting on stage is in 1660 by a woman named Margaret Hughes. She acted before the king accepted it, and then women were allowed on stage. So for example, you're going to read in Macbeth, it says, "You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so." So with the witches that show up in Macbeth, what you find is that Macbeth is talking to them and he's like, "Hey, you look like women, but you have beards." Because they're witches and they are fantastical creatures, old men were actually playing the witches. Now, Shakespeare was careful about what he wrote about. He wrote about other kings in other countries. What would happen if he wrote mean or malicious things about his own queen or king? He could be beheaded. It's considered treason if you're going to talk meanly about your king or queen, and that meant that, yeah, you would be killed for it. So the tragedy of Macbeth was written in 1606, and Macbeth has a curse behind it. Usually, if you ever appear on a stage, you will never call the play Macbeth. You will call it the Scottish play. So this is how it came to be. It says, "For the first performance of Macbeth, the actor who was supposed to play Macbeth fell ill before the show and died." It says even King James I was so angry about the play that he banned the performance of it. He thought that the witches, how they were making spells and potions and everything else, it sounded too real. And more recently in the performance history of the play, there's a riot that broke out, real swords were used, actors were hurt, and a lot of other things. And then, of course, we call it the Scottish play because it takes place in Scotland. Now, here's the irony here, is that Shakespeare's plays are not original. Everything he used, all the ideas come from somewhere else. So for example, Macbeth is based on Holingshed's Chronicles. It's a history text of Britain. There's a real king of Macbeth of Scotland. However, they don't have the same lives. And of course, the real king lived in the 11th century. So, what makes Shakespeare super interesting is his Shakespearean language. He created language that looks and sounds very different. So, for example, he had both really poor people, the people that would stand around the stage, the groundlings, he would have them attend the theater. So, he had to have characters that could make them laugh and make them enjoy the play more than just this high language he created. So we have comic characters who would end up uh, doing body humor. They would have fart jokes, they would laugh at themselves, they would fall over, whatever. And then you also have high class language and high class people. So low class people were known by their jobs, and high class people were known by their names. So, for example, Macbeth, considered high class, considered rich, his language will look and sound like poetry. Each line will start with a capital letter. The line lengths will be similar in length. And it's actually written in iambic pentameter, which means there's 10 stressed and unstressed syllables per line. Hearing poetry and thinking about poetry made it more challenging for the rich people that attended the plays to listen to it. You had to read more into it. Okay, so we're going to learn about what happens in the plot of Macbeth. There's, as in everything, the exposition, the rising action, the climax, the most exciting part, and then the falling action and the resolution. We're going to learn about the characters of Macbeth. So we have King Duncan. He's a king of Scotland. We have Malcolm, his firstborn, and Donalbain. Those are his two sons. We have Macbeth. He's a general. We have his wife, Lady Macbeth. We have his friend and another general in the army called Banquo, who has his own son, Fleance. He's a boy child. We have Macduff, who's a general. We have his wife, Lady Macduff. We have his son. He's not given a name, but he shows up in the play as well. We also have 3 witches. 3 is a huge number that has religious significance and is also very important. And of course, we have Hecate, the goddess of witches. She shows up in a few of the scenes. One of them is debatable about whether it actually exists. Okay, character motivations. So what do the characters want, which affects what they do? So everybody's going to want something different, which is going to lead them to act in different ways. This is why they're motivated by those things. The faults of the main characters. Ambition is the drive to get something no matter what. So you'll find that the faults are the reasons that the characters go astray or end up in bad ways. So Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, they're big into that. And of course, the chaos caused by the witches. And here's a couple of pictures. Now remember, a play was written to be performed on stage. So imagine the characters on stage as you read the play. This will help you to see how the play was constructed, to see how dramatic crises are reached, how tension is created, how themes are linked through the characters. And often things are repeated because it's a stage play. The audience would not have the text in front of them, and they needed to be reminded of what happened, what was said, and what others did. We will listen. This is another way to listen to the actual play. If you wanted to try so you could, but you do not have to. I've included all these different ways of listening to it, watching it, and being able to understand it in different ways. There are a variety of adaptations of Macbeth out there. So it's a basic storyline that's used in literature, movies, plays. So for example, there's one called Throne of Blood. There's Macbeth. There's Scotland, PA, which is one of my favorites. So instead of just talking about Scotland, this one talks about not ruling Scotland, but having a burger joint. I hope that gave you a better understanding of Macbeth, just so that you understand what it kind of looks like, what it's going to sound like, a little bit of the background behind it, and hopefully that will help your understanding be deeper.